At my father's will, reading the air was thick with a silence that felt rehearsed, like everyone had agreed beforehand to pretend nothing was wrong until the moment came. The mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier polished so perfectly that it reflected the nervous glances of cousins and the forced smiles of aunts. My father's lawyer, Mr. Harris, carefully unsealed the envelope, the sound of tearing paper loud in the stillness. When Victoria leaned forward, her lips twisting into the smirk I had known since childhood, she did not wait for the words of the will. She did not wait for the truth. She wanted the strike to be hers. "You will get nothing. Emily," she hissed, her voice slicing across the table. Every head turned toward me as if on cue, like actors following stage directions, while my sister leaned back with a satisfaction that only cruelty can produce. For a brief second, I wondered if she might be joking, but the way Michael shifted uneasily in his chair, the way my mother Margaret allowed the corner of her mouth to curve upward in approval, and the way silence fell like a heavy curtain, told me this was not a slip of the tongue. This was a declaration. My cousins lowered their eyes, one fiddling with a napkin, another tapping nervously at his wineglass, desperate to appear occupied while pretending they had not heard. The truth was, they had, and they wanted to escape the discomfort of it without daring to intervene. That was the rhythm of this family. Victoria spoke, others stayed silent, and I absorbed the blow. But this was not the sting of a single sentence, it was the echo of a lifetime of them. It was every whispered insult, every cruel laugh, every time she reminded me that in this house I was small, unworthy less. It all condensed into those 4 words. "You will get nothing." I could feel the weight of my father's absence pressing against my chest as if he were the only shield I had ever known, and now he was gone, leaving me in the arena with wolves who smelled blood. Victoria's eyes glittered with triumph, her fingers tapping lightly on the table as if she were already signing the papers that would cut me out. My mother's hand rested on Victoria's wrist, a gesture that looked gentle, but carried the message of solidarity, a silent chorus saying, "We agree. She deserves nothing." Even Michael, who should have been my ally as my brother, kept his gaze fixed on the floor, too cowardly to stand against the tide. I sat still, my palms pressed flat against my knees beneath the table, my face calm, though I felt the rush of heat crawling up my throat. If I flinched, she would win. If I protested, they would twist my words into hysteria. So I let the sentence linger, hovering in the air like smoke, thick and choking, spreading into every corner of the room. Victoria believed she had seized the moment that she had struck the final blow before the will could even be read, that humiliation would silence me as it always had. What she did not see, what none of them saw, was the flicker of movement in the hallway behind the lawyer, the shadow of uniforms waiting, the measured steps approaching that would soon turn her smirk to stone. In that instant, surrounded by eyes that judged and mouths that stayed shut, I understood what my father had prepared for what he had left behind, and I knew this day would not end the way Victoria intended. The day had started the same way every family gathering seemed to start in my life, with a message from my mother that felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. The text arrived at 9:14 that morning, blunt and stripped of anything resembling warmth. Will reading. Be on time. No hello, Emily, no. How are you holding up after Dad's funeral? No hint that she recognized me as her daughter and not an inconvenience. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I could have written something sharp, something to let her know I saw through her command. Maybe even asked, should I sit on the floor this time, or will there be a chair? But instead, I tapped a single word. Okay. With her every extra syllable was ammunition, and I had learned over the years that silence and restraint were sometimes the only armor I had. The hours leading up to the reading of the will stretched out endlessly. I tried to distract myself with small chores, folding laundry, rinsing dishes, anything to keep my mind from circling back to the truth I could not avoid. This was not just about paper signatures or the property Dad left behind. This was about hierarchy, about who mattered, about who could control the story now that his voice had been silenced. My sister Victoria had always claimed the role of the air and spirit long before it was about money. As children, she controlled the games, decided the rules, and if I ever dared to win, she changed them on the spot so that victory belonged to her again. My brother Michael followed quietly, a shadow more comfortable agreeing than confronting, while my mother Margaret enforced her loyalty to Victoria with the certainty of a general protecting her chosen soldier. My father Richard had been the only balance in that equation, the only person who looked me in the eye as though my existence had value. He was gone now, and with him went the only shield that had ever made my family's cruelty bearable. As I prepared to leave my apartment that afternoon, pulling my coat tighter against the February wind, I rehearsed the plan in my head. Be polite, be brief, do not react. Listen to the lawyer collect the facts, walk away intact. It was a plan I had created 100 times before for dinners, holidays, birthdays. Survival strategies for evenings designed less to celebrate and more to remind me of where I stood. By the time I reached my mother's house, the cold air cutting through my scarf, I already knew my plan would not survive the evening. The moment I stepped inside, the shift was immediate. My cousin's laughter, loud and bright in the kitchen, dimmed as if someone had turned down the volume. A quick hug from Michael, barely a second long before he stepped back as though physical contact was too much to risk. Victoria's eyes slid over me with the kind of disdain that does not need words. My mother gave a tight nod, nothing more. The house itself felt like an accomplice, warm with scented candles and polished wood, but cold in its welcome. Even the seating had been arranged with precision. Victoria and Michael sat beside Margaret at the center of the long, polished table, their places set with matching crystal glasses and pristine linen napkins. My chair waited at the far end, slightly pushed back from the table, with a water glass that did not match the others, cloudy and old, pulled from the back of a cupboard. Tiny details, but in my family, nothing was ever accidental. Every placement carried a message. You are here, but not one of us. You are visible, but not included. I sat down quietly, smoothing my skirt beneath me, my mind tracing the pattern I had recognized since childhood. They did not need to shout me down. They just needed to build a wall of silence high enough that my voice could not climb over it. The room where the will was to be read had the kind of formal stillness that made every small sound echo louder than it should. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall, the faint rattle of the heating vent, the shuffling of papers in Mr. Harris's leather briefcase. He stood at the head of the table with a posture that suggested long practice in maintaining neutrality. His face carefully composed, his voice calm as he cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. My eyes scanned the table again, unwilling but unable to stop myself from noticing every detail that reinforced the invisible lines drawn between us. Victoria sat closest to the lawyer as though proximity gave her authority. Her hair styled perfectly, her blouse pressed without a crease, her entire body language screaming confidence and control. Michael leaned toward her shoulders, angled away from me. His expression blank, a mask of loyalty that required no words. Margaret sat directly between them. Her matriarchal seat of power secured her hand resting lightly on Victoria's arm in a gesture that looked motherly but radiated alliance. Around them, the cousins and aunts filled the remaining chairs in clusters, their chatter subdued, now the forced brightness of their greetings already fading as anticipation settled into the room. My chair, set slightly back from the line of the table, felt more like a spectator's seat than a participant's. The napkin folded loosely beside my plate was thinner, less crisp than the others. My water glass, mismatched and cloudy, caught the light differently, a dull reflection compared to the gleam of crystal. Even the chair itself wobbled faintly when I shifted my weight, the leg uneven against the polished floor. None of these details were accidents. They were messages, small but clear reminders that I was not a true part of the circle, that my place was conditional, fragile, easy to remove. Mr. Harris began with formalities, acknowledging the presence of witnesses, noting the importance of the sealed documents. His voice was steady, practiced, but every pause he took seemed to stretch in the air like a taut string ready to snap. I could feel the eyes around me sliding in my direction, not openly hostile, but watchful, waiting for any sign of reaction they could seize on later. I kept my gaze fixed on the lawyer's hands, watching the careful way he unfolded the papers, smoothing each corner with precision as if the order of his movements could anchor the tension in the room. Victoria, however, could not wait. She tapped her manicured nails lightly against the wood, a rhythmic signal of her impatience, her smirk curling each time the lawyer's words slowed. The sound dug into me like a metronome counting down the seconds to humiliation. Michael shifted beside her, his knee bouncing faintly under the table, betraying a nervous energy he did not dare express. Margaret leaned back, her eyes sliding toward me with that familiar cold appraisal, a gaze that said, "You are here at my mercy, nothing more." My cousins whispered among themselves, their voices hushed, but their glances sharp flicking between Victoria's poised confidence and my measured stillness. It was a performance, and everyone knew their part. The family had perfected this choreography over years. The lawyer would read, Victoria would gloat, Margaret would validate, Michael would stay silent, and I would endure. The weight of that pattern pressed on my shoulders, but beneath it, I felt something else rising, something sharper, stronger, the certainty that this time would not follow the script they had written for me. Mr. Harris cleared his throat again and prepared to speak, and for a fleeting second, the entire room seemed to inhale at once, waiting for the words that would either confirm or shatter the assumptions hanging heavy in the air. The will had not even been read yet when the familiar rhythm of tiny cuts began the subtle choreography my family had mastered to remind me of my place. Victoria tilted her head toward Michael and spoke just loudly enough for the table to hear. "Remember when Emily tried to run that little shop a few years ago?" she said with a laugh that carried no warmth. "It barely lasted 6 months." Michael chuckled obligingly, though his eyes darted to me with a flicker of guilt before he looked away. I felt the sting, but I stayed silent. That was the point of these jabs, not to destroy me in one blow, but to chip at me piece by piece until I broke. Margaret added her own layer, leaning forward with the kind of smile that looked kind to an outsider, but which I had learned long ago was only camouflage. "At least you are resilient, Emily," she said, her tone heavy with implication. The word resilient in her mouth meant stubborn, pathetic someone too incapable to collapse when she should have. A cousin joined in, then mentioning how hard it must be to live alone in the city. "That poor apartment of yours is so small," she said sweetly, and her husband nodded as if they had shared a private joke. I remembered the nights I had struggled to pay rent, the battles with a corrupt landlord, the nights I ate canned soup for dinner while working 2 jobs, and I remembered how none of them had been there. Yet here at this table, the narrative twisted, as it always did, into proof of my inadequacy. Each word stacked against me, each interruption designed to silence. I opened my mouth once to add a detail to Michael's story about a family vacation, to remind them that I had been there too, but Victoria cut across me without missing a beat. "You were too young to remember," she said flatly, dismissing me as though my memories did not count. My mother laughed softly at that, a sound that wrapped itself around the table and told everyone else to laugh too. They obeyed. I forced my lips into something that resembled a smile, even as my chest burned. It was not the laughter itself that hurt. It was the way the room bent around it, the way even those who should have known better chose the safety of complicity over the risk of kindness. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, trying to pull the focus back to the papers in his hands, but the damage had already been set in motion. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her arm draped across the backrest, as though she owned not just her seat, but the entire room. She tapped her glass lightly and remarked, "Some people just never grow up." The phrase carried enough venom to sting, without being overt a performance of casualness that gave her cover if challenged. My mother nodded, adding, "Some things never change." The words felt like another knife slipped between my ribs. Around me, my cousins smiled politely. One aunt even murmured agreement as though cruelty had become tradition. It was gaslighting in its purest form. Cruelty dressed as humor dismissal, disguised as observation. Insults coated with sugar so that if I dared to call them out, I would look hysterical, oversensitive, ungrateful. I felt my jaw tighten, but I said nothing. That was what they expected for me to lash out, for me to give them a scene they could later twist into evidence of my instability. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching the way it made them shift in their seats, uncomfortable in the stillness they had created. Inside me, though, something was shifting. Each jab no longer sank me lower. Instead, it hardened into resolve. Every time they laughed, every time they erased me, I stored it like evidence in a trial that had not yet begun. My father had once told me that silence can be stronger than shouting, that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is refuse to play the part assigned to you. I thought of him now, of the way he used to stand between me and their cruelty, and I felt his absence like a bruise that had never healed. But I also felt his presence in the memory of his words, in the knowledge that he had prepared for this moment in ways none of them suspected. Victoria smirked again, confident certain that she had written the script of this day. Margaret leaned back, satisfied, believing the balance of power was secured. Michael stayed silent, the weight of his cowardice pressing heavier with each passing second. And I sat at the far end of the table, my mismatched glass of water untouched, my hands folded neatly in my lap, appearing calm even as inside me the storm gathered. I knew then, with absolute clarity, that this performance they thought they were staging would not end the way they imagined. The room had settled into a tense rhythm of chatter and silence when Victoria finally decided she had sharpened her knives enough. Mr. Harris was mid-sentence unfolding the first page of the will when she leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through his words. "Why are we even wasting time with all this?" she said, her tone dripping with false boredom. "Everyone knows Dad left Emily nothing." The sentence landed like a thunderclap. For one heartbeat there was no sound, only the collective shift of eyes turning toward me. Michael's fork froze halfway to his mouth. My mother's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smirk. The cousins blinked quickly as though they were unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Mr. Harris stiffened his eyes, narrowing briefly at the interruption, but he did not speak. He looked at me instead, his gaze steady, almost searching, as if gauging whether I would crumble now or wait. Victoria sat back with triumph radiating from every line of her body. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, the picture of confidence. She believed she had ended the game before it began. My hands remained folded on my lap, my breathing slow and deliberate. I let the silence grow until the weight of it pressed against the walls, until the discomfort shifted from me to them. My cousins coughed lightly. One aunt shifted in her chair. Michael glanced away, unable to hold the scene. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on me, waiting for the crack, waiting for the outburst. She wanted me to snap so she could sigh later and say, "See, always so dramatic, always so ungrateful." But I had learned too much to give her that gift. Instead, I lifted my glass of water, the mismatched cloudy one that had been chosen just for me, and took a slow sip. The gesture was deliberate, calculated, a refusal to be rushed. When I set it down again, the sound of glass against wood echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. "Thank you for your concern, Victoria," I said evenly, my voice calm, almost gentle, "but I think we should let the lawyer speak." The sentence was simple, controlled, but the effect rippled across the table. Victoria's smirk faltered just slightly. Margaret's head tilted in disappointment. The cousins looked down as though embarrassed. Mr. Harris cleared his throat and resumed reading, though his eyes flicked toward me again with something almost like respect. The blow had been delivered, but it had not destroyed me. Instead, it had revealed the shape of the battle. Victoria was not content to let the will speak for itself. She wanted the performance, the humiliation, the victory that only came from making me bleed in public. She thought her words had done it, that she had written the ending before the story began. What she did not realize was that I was letting her build the stage higher, letting her prepare the spotlight, because when the real truth came, it would not just knock her down, it would shatter the illusion she had wrapped around herself for years. The rest of the table returned slowly to conversation, but the air was different now. Every glance carried an edge, every pause carried expectation. I could feel the tension hanging, the awareness that this was not over. Victoria leaned toward Margaret and whispered something I could not hear, but I saw the way my mother's lips tightened into a thin smile, the way her hand brushed her daughter's arm in affirmation. They thought they had me cornered. They thought the first blow had left me staggering. What they did not see was the steadiness in my eyes, the calm I had chosen, the patience I was wielding like a blade, because I knew something they did not. I knew that my father had left more than words in that envelope. He had left truth, and truth was about to walk into this room with footsteps that none of them could stop. After Victoria's declaration, the lawyer pressed on, his voice steady, but the edge of irritation plain as he tried to regain control of the room. Yet the undercurrent of hostility remained wrapping itself around me like a shroud. Every time Mr. Harris paused to clear his throat or shuffle a page, Victoria found a way to mutter something under her breath that was just loud enough for others to hear. Some people never learn, she whispered once her eyes fixed on me. Michael let out a quiet laugh, though it sounded more nervous than genuine, and quickly glanced down at his plate. Margaret reached for her glass of wine, her bracelets clinking lightly, and said in that falsely sweet tone that always disguised poison, "Emily has always been so sensitive, bless her heart." The phrase ignited memories like sparks catching on dry tinder. I thought back to Thanksgiving 5 years ago when my mother had told me not to bring anything, insisting she had ordered all the pies, only to announce in front of everyone later that I had failed again, arriving empty-handed as usual. I had stayed quiet then, swallowing humiliation because speaking would only make me look defensive. I remembered the year I moved apartments, and she told my brothers that I had refused her help, when the truth was, she had never offered. By the time they carried boxes into my new place, the story had already been rewritten, and I was cast as ungrateful once more. Each jab tonight echoed those years, every small insult a reminder of a lifetime of calculated cruelty. My cousins chimed in now, retelling vacations with laughter that curved neatly around me, excluding me as though I had never been there. I wanted to speak to remind them of moments I had lived too, but every time I opened my mouth, Victoria cut in, redirecting the story, twisting the details. At one point, Michael described a storm we had all endured during a summer at the beach house, and I started to add a memory about how we had all slept in the living room together to feel safe. Before I could finish, Victoria laughed loudly and said Emily was probably crying in the corner. The table erupted with chuckles. I felt my pulse hammer against my temples, but I forced my expression into calm. Inside, I stored the memory away, another mark in the long tally I had been keeping since childhood. Mr. Harris continued his monotone, now background noise, against the performance unfolding around him. He looked at me once, his eyes steady, and I wondered if he saw the storm I was containing. Margaret reached across the table, then patting Victoria's hand with pride and said, "Some things never change." The words were casual, delivered as though they were harmless, but I knew them for what they were. A warning that in her eyes I would never grow, never rise above the smallness she insisted on assigning to me. I stared at the pattern in the tablecloth, the sharp lines crossing over one another, and thought of my father. Richard Turner had been the only one who never played these games, the only one who looked at me without calculation. I remembered the nights he would find me crying in my room after Margaret had scolded me or Victoria had mocked me. He would sit quietly, not filling the silence with false comfort, but steady, letting me know I was seen. I thought of the letter he had written to me years ago, tucked away in my drawer, where he told me that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was the decision to wait, to watch, to strike when the truth could not be denied. Those words hummed in me now, steadying me like a lifeline. Around the table, the tension thickened. My cousins grew quieter, their laughter sounding forced. One aunt stole a glance at me, her expression unreadable, before looking away quickly. The weight of anticipation grew with every passing minute, and I knew we were approaching the breaking point. Victoria's confidence gleamed brighter with each interruption. Margaret's satisfaction deepened. Michael's silence became heavier, but beneath it all, I felt the shift. The truth was coming, and they could not see it. They thought the story was theirs to tell, but they were wrong. This time, I would not let them control the ending. The lawyer's voice finally cut through the noise with an authority that silenced even Victoria for a brief moment. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses, his tone firm, as he began reading the first line of my father's will. "Richard Turner, being of sound mind and body at the time of writing, hereby declares—" The words were heavy, each syllable carrying the weight of finality. Everyone leaned forward slightly, anticipation humming through the room like static. Victoria crossed her arms, already smirking, as though she knew exactly what would come next, while Margaret's eyes gleamed with the quiet satisfaction of a woman certain her chosen daughter would inherit control. Michael shifted in his chair, anxious, perhaps fearful of the confrontation he knew was brewing. My heart thudded, but I kept my face neutral, my hands folded on the table. Mr. Harris continued outlining small bequests. First, pieces of jewelry, to cousins, family heirlooms, to aunts, small sums of money distributed here and there. With each line, the tension built, the silence around the table thickening, everyone waiting for the portion that mattered most, the estate, the house, the financial legacy my father had spent his life building. Victoria's nails tapped impatiently against the wood, the rhythm sharp and grating. When Mr. Harris finally cleared his throat and read the words, the room seemed to stop breathing. To my youngest daughter, Emily Turner, I leave the family home the entirety of my remaining shares in Turner & Co. and the balance of my personal savings account. Gasps broke the silence. One aunt dropping her fork onto her plate with a clatter, a cousin whispering, "Oh my God," under her breath. My chest tightened, a rush of heat surging through me as the words echoed in the air. For a moment, disbelief held me still. Victoria's face drained of color, her mouth falling open before snapping shut again. "No!" she hissed, shaking her head as though she could physically reject the truth. "That is not possible. Dad would never." Margaret reached for her hand, her voice low but sharp. "Quiet, Victoria." But Victoria could not be silenced. She pushed back her chair slightly, her voice rising. She manipulated him. She got into his head. He was old. He was sick. He did not know what he was doing. The accusation cut through the air, a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed. "I can assure you, Miss Turner, your father was entirely competent at the time of drafting this will. I was present and I have the documents to prove it." But Victoria's desperation had already broken loose. She slammed her hand on the table, the sound making everyone jump. "She has always been manipulative. She spat her eyes boring into me. She convinced him to cut us out." Margaret's lips pressed tightly, her eyes flashing with anger, but she said nothing, letting her eldest daughter unravel. Michael looked stricken, glancing between us, caught between loyalty to his sister and the undeniable authority of the lawyer's words. I sat still, my pulse steadying as I realized the shift had begun. The narrative was no longer hers to control. Mr. Harris reached into his briefcase, then pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your father anticipated there might be disputes," he said, his voice calm but firm. He left letters to accompany the will to clarify his intentions. He held up the envelope marked with my name. "This one is addressed to you, Emily." My throat tightened as I took it, the familiar handwriting on the front making my chest ache. I did not open it yet, only held it, letting its presence speak louder than any words I could form. Victoria's face twisted with fury, her voice cracking as she shouted, "This is a setup! She forged that letter. She probably tricked you into it." That was when the sound came, heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway beyond the door. The shift in the room was immediate, heads turning, eyes widening as the measured rhythm grew closer. The door opened and two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence sucking the air from the room. "Good evening," the taller one said, his tone clipped professional. "We are here regarding an investigation into financial misconduct." The words struck like lightning, freezing everyone in place. Victoria's eyes darted wildly, her smirk gone, replaced by panic. Margaret's face paled, her hand dropping from her daughter's arm. Michael swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Harris's voice was steady as he spoke. "Mr. Turner provided evidence prior to his passing that certain assets had been mishandled. The officers have come to follow up on that report." One of the officers pulled out a file, flipping it open, and began reading. "Evidence suggests attempts were made to falsify financial documents in the months leading up to Mr. Turner's death. These attempts appear linked to Victoria Turner." The room erupted into gasps and whispers, cousins covering their mouths, aunts exchanging horrified looks. Victoria leapt to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That is a lie!" she screamed, her voice high and frantic. "I never!" But the officer cut her off calmly. "We have records of forged signatures, attempted withdrawals, and correspondence that ties directly to you." Victoria's face twisted, desperation pouring from every feature as she looked around the table for support. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Michael's eyes dropped to the table, shame flooding his expression. No one came to her aid. The officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Victoria Turner, you are under arrest for fraud and attempted embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." The metallic click of cuffs snapping around her wrists echoed louder than any insult she had thrown at me that night. The smirk that had defined her face all evening was gone, replaced by wide eyes brimming with disbelief. She turned toward Margaret. "Mother, do something. But Margaret only stared at her, her hands trembling, her mask of control shattered. The officers began leading her toward the door, her protests growing weaker with each step. I watched in silence, my face calm, my heart steady, the storm inside me finally finding its release. For the first time in years, I was not the one being humiliated in front of this family. For the first time, the truth was undeniable, public, and irreversible. The room remained hushed, the only sounds Victoria's fading voice and the steady steps of Justice walking her out the door. The silence that followed Victoria's arrest was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that house, not even in the ugliest fights of my childhood. It was a silence thick with shame, disbelief, and the faint, crackling sound of illusions collapsing. The door had barely closed behind the officers when all eyes turned toward me, some wide with horror, others clouded with guilt, a few narrowed with resentment, as though somehow I had orchestrated this downfall to my advantage. Margaret was the first to break her voice. Trembling, yet sharp, the voice of a woman who had controlled rooms her entire life and was suddenly powerless. "You think this makes you the victor, Emily? Do not delude yourself. Your father may have left you property, but you will never have what matters. You will never be one of us." She spat the last words as though they were poison, her hand slamming onto the table for emphasis. Michael shifted beside her, his face pale, his eyes flicking toward me with something like shame. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. He had lived in the shadow of Margaret and Victoria too long, his loyalty cemented in silence, his courage worn thin by years of compliance. My cousins whispered among themselves, their earlier laughter gone, replaced by nervous murmurs and furtive glances. Mr. Harris sat at the head of the table, his hands folded over the will, his gaze steady on me waiting. For the first time that night, I let the calm mask slip. I sat up straighter, my voice ringing out across the table, steady but edged with fire. "My entire life you have tried to make me small, to erase me with your whispers and your lies, to turn me into the family scapegoat so you could shine brighter." My words were directed at Margaret now, her eyes narrowing as I spoke. "You told everyone I was weak, ungrateful, sensitive. You built a narrative where Victoria was the golden daughter, Michael, the dutiful son, and I was nothing but a burden." I paused, letting the words hang, my chest rising and falling steadily. "But the truth has always been bigger than your lies. Tonight proves it. The will, the letter, the evidence, it all proves that Dad saw me. He saw who you really were." Margaret's lips parted, her breath sharp, but I pressed on, my voice louder now, gathering momentum like a storm. "You built this facade of control, but it is over. Everyone saw what happened here. Everyone saw the police lead Victoria away in handcuffs. Everyone saw the truth you could not hide." The cousins looked down, shifting in their seats, unable to meet my eyes. An aunt wiped at her face. Her expression troubled while another leaned back, arms crossed, clearly reassessing the stories she had believed for years. Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to retort. "You think they will stand with you? They know your history. They know your weakness." I cut her off sharply. "They know your cruelty. They know how you turned this family into a stage where only you and Victoria could play the heroes. But the show is over, Mother. The audience has seen the script." The hush that followed was deeper this time, heavier, because the truth had been spoken aloud in a way that could not be unsaid. I turned to Michael, then his face pale, his eyes downcast. "Michael," I said, my voice softer but still firm. "You watched. You always watched. You let her tear me apart piece by piece and never spoke. You laughed when Victoria mocked me. You stayed silent when Margaret rewrote the truth." He flinched, his shoulders curling inward, the weight of guilt pressing visibly on him. "You still have a choice," I continued. "You can keep protecting them, or you can admit what you saw, what you know." For a moment, he did not move, the silence stretching unbearably until finally he whispered, his voice breaking. "She is right." Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing, but Michael's words grew steadier. "Emily is right. I saw it all. I let it happen." He dropped his face into his hands, his shoulders trembling. The room seemed to tilt as the admission settled. The cousins stared shocked while Margaret's mask shattered further, the fury in her eyes unable to conceal the fear. Mr. Harris finally spoke, his tone grave but calm. "This will be recorded. The court will see the evidence. The will is clear. The law is clear." He turned toward me, then his gaze steady. "And the truth is clear." I inhaled slowly, the air tasting different now, cleaner, sharper, as though the poison of years had finally begun to dissipate. I stood holding the sealed letter my father had left for me. "I have stayed quiet for years," I said, my voice carrying across the table. "Tonight, I will not." My father believed in me. The law has upheld his words. The police have revealed the truth. I will not be silenced anymore. The words echoed in the room, the kind of statement that settles into memory unshakable. Margaret glared at me, her lips trembling, her hands shaking faintly. But she did not speak. She could not. For the first time, she had no script, no stage, no audience willing to believe her fiction. The performance was over. The hours that followed passed in a haze that felt both surreal and inevitable. The image of Victoria being led away in handcuffs replayed in my mind a scene I had once dreamed of in my darkest moments but never truly believed I would see. The house felt different without her, as though some shadow had been ripped away, leaving the room too bright, too raw. Margaret remained seated at the table, her hands trembling faintly, her eyes glassy and distant. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, the armor of control stripped away, revealing only a woman left exposed in front of the very audience she had once commanded. Michael sat beside her, hunched over, unable to meet anyone's gaze, his earlier confession echoing in the silence. My cousins whispered among themselves, their faces pale, their tones hushed. A few of them avoided my eyes entirely, but others glanced at me differently, now no longer with pity or scorn, but with something resembling curiosity, even respect. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his voice steady as he reminded everyone that the proceedings would continue through the courts, that my father's will had been made legally sound, and that disputes would be futile. His professionalism grounded the room, but the ripple of unease could not be contained. When the evening finally ended, people left in clusters, their conversations low and hurried. I caught fragments of their words as they drifted down the hallway. "Did you hear what the officer said? Forged documents? Imagine that?" She always seemed too perfect, too sure of herself. Poor Emily, all those years. Some of them looked at me as they passed, their gazes heavy with new understanding. Others could not look at me at all, burdened by the knowledge that they had once laughed at the jokes made at my expense. Outside, the cool night air met me like a balm, clearing the haze that clung to my chest. Neighbors had already gathered near the gate, word traveling faster than the evening had ended. Whispers spread, questions flew, and eyes turned to me with a mixture of shock and hunger for detail. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned closer to catch every word that slipped from those who had been inside. Margaret emerged eventually, her face tight, her shoulders stiff as she moved quickly to her car. People murmured her name, but no one stopped her. No one comforted her. She had built her reputation on superiority, and now she walked through a crowd that saw only failure. Michael followed slowly behind his steps, heavy, his gaze fixed on the ground. Someone muttered, "He should have spoken sooner," and the words hung in the air like judgment. In the days that followed, the story spread further. Calls came from distant relatives, their voices tinged with disbelief as they asked what really happened. Old friends of my father reached out, their support steady and warm, some admitting they had long suspected the fractures beneath the Turner family facade. At the local church, whispers followed Margaret into the pews. Where once she had held court with confidence, now she sat isolated people, nodding politely, but no longer hanging on her every word. At the grocery store, I overheard two women discussing Victoria, their voices low, but their tone incredulous. Fraud. Can you believe it? And all those years, she acted as though she was better than everyone else. Emily, on the other hand, maybe we misjudged her. The shift was subtle but undeniable. For the first time, the narrative was no longer against me. The cruel stories that had defined me for decades were unraveling, replaced by questions, by reconsideration, by doubt cast on those who had wielded power with such certainty. Yet the aftermath was not only about others. Inside me, a storm was settling into clarity. The weight of years of humiliation had not vanished, but it no longer chained me. I could walk into a room without bracing for the next cut. I could breathe without waiting for the next whisper. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. Margaret would not forgive Michael, would not suddenly grow brave, and Victoria's fate would be fought in courtrooms and prisons. But the truth was out, and it was public, and it could not be erased. That was enough. Standing at my father's grave a few days later, I held the sealed letter I still had not opened, the ink of his handwriting staring up at me. Around me, the world felt quieter, the sky wide and open, the air carrying the faint scent of grass. I laid my hand against the cool stone and whispered softly, "They cannot hurt me anymore, Dad. Not in the way they once did." I felt a steadiness inside me, a peace I had not known since childhood, and I knew this was only the beginning of living differently, of living freely. The letter weighed heavily in my hands as I sat at my small kitchen table the evening quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Days had passed since the will reading, and though the sting of confrontation still lingered, a strange calm had begun to take root inside me. I traced my father's handwriting with my thumb, the loops and curves so familiar, so steady. Finally, I broke the seal and unfolded the paper, his voice spilling out in words that seemed to bridge the chasm of death itself. "My dearest Emily," it began, "I know by the time you read this, I will no longer be by your side. I regret that I did not shield you more from the cruelty of your mother and sister. I saw what they did, the way they diminished you, and it pained me more than I ever let on. I chose to stay silent at times. I should have spoken, and for that I ask your forgiveness." Tears blurred the ink as I read his words, both balm and blade. He continued, "You are stronger than they ever allowed you to believe. I leave you the house and my savings not out of favoritism, but because I trust you to use them wisely to build a life free of their chains. Let this inheritance be a tool, not a burden. Let it be your freedom." I folded the letter back carefully, my hands trembling as I pressed it to my chest. For years, I had longed for acknowledgement, for someone to say out loud that I was not the problem, not the failure they claimed. And here it was written in the ink of the man who had raised me, undeniable, permanent. The following week, I returned to the lawyer's office to finalize the transfer of assets. Mr. Harris was as professional as ever, but his eyes softened when he handed me the documents. "Your father was a practical man," he said quietly. But he was also wise. He knew what he was doing. Outside, the world seemed brighter, though I knew shadows still lingered. Margaret had not reached out since that night, but word traveled. At church, she sat alone, whispers following her like a second shadow. At family gatherings I did not attend, she tried to rally sympathy, painting herself as betrayed by a husband and daughter who conspired against her. But fewer and fewer listened. Michael, I heard, had retreated further into himself, guilt eating away at him. He had admitted the truth too late, and the weight of that inaction now pressed heavily on his shoulders. As for Victoria, her case moved swiftly. The evidence my father had secured was irrefutable, and the community watched in shock as the once proud daughter of Margaret Turner stood in court accused of fraud and embezzlement. Some relatives tried to defend her, insisting she had been led astray, but the handcuffs told their own story. For the first time, she faced consequences that could not be spun into someone else's fault. I did not attend the hearings, but I read the reports. Each article that mentioned her name alongside words like indictment and guilty felt like a strange vindication, a public undoing of decades of unchecked cruelty. Yet I did not revel in it. The satisfaction was not in her downfall, but in the truth being seen in the years of gaslighting unraveling under the weight of evidence. At home, I walked through the halls of the Turner house, my house now feeling both the ghosts of my past and the promise of a different future. The walls had absorbed years of shouted insults, sharp laughter at my expense, but they also held memories of my father's quiet kindness of moments when he tried, however imperfectly, to remind me I was loved. Standing in the living room, I whispered, "I will not waste this. This house will no longer be a stage for cruelty. It will be my sanctuary." In the weeks that followed, I began making small changes, fresh paint on the walls, flowers in the windowsills, laughter invited in from friends who had stood quietly by me for years, but had been pushed away by my family's disdain. Slowly, the house shifted from a monument of pain to a symbol of resilience, and within myself, I felt the same shift. The inheritance was not just money or bricks and mortar, it was validation, it was liberation, it was the chance to finally write my own story instead of living as a footnote in Margaret and Victoria's version. I understood now that justice does not always roar in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly in signed documents and sealed letters in the whispered acknowledgement of truth by those who once denied it. And sometimes justice does roar in the click of handcuffs in the silence of a room that once mocked you but now cannot meet your eyes. As I stood on the porch of the Turner house one quiet evening, the sun dipping low and the air carrying the scent of blooming jasmine, I realized something profound. For years, I had believed that survival meant silence, that the only way to endure the cruelty of my mother and sister was to shrink myself until I became invisible. But silence had never protected me. It had only protected them. It was the truth spoken aloud, the evidence revealed, the courage to face them publicly that had finally set me free. I thought of Margaret sitting alone in church, stripped of her power by whispers she could not control. I thought of Michael weighed down by guilt for the words he had never spoken until it was too late. I thought of Victoria facing prison, her perfect mask shattered by her own greed. They were each living with the consequences of their choices, and for once those consequences were real and undeniable. And I thought of my father, whose letter rested safely in my desk drawer, his words reminding me daily that I had always been more than the role they forced on me. The inheritance he left was not just a house or money. It was a second chance, a gift of freedom and recognition that no one could strip away. I knew that scars would remain. Family wounds cut deep, and healing would be a journey, not a destination. But I also knew that I was no longer trapped. I was no longer defined by their cruelty. I was defined by my choice to resist, to fight back, to expose the truth. As I looked out across the street, I saw a neighbor wave her smile warm. People no longer looked at me with pity or suspicion. They saw strength now, resilience. They saw someone who had endured the storm and emerged standing. And in that moment, I felt something I had not felt in decades: peace. To those listening, I say this: if you have lived in the shadow of cruelty, if your voice has been stolen by those who thrive on control, know that silence is not safety. Know that you are not weak for enduring, but you are powerful when you choose to resist. Justice does not always come swiftly, but it comes. Sometimes in the form of truth spoken aloud, sometimes in the form of a letter that validates your worth, sometimes in the sound of handcuffs clicking shut on the wrists of those who thought they were untouchable. Do not let them convince you that you are powerless. Do not let their lies become your story. You have the strength to write your own. I am Emily Turner, and for years my family told me I was nothing. But today I stand as proof that even the most toxic bonds can be broken, that even the deepest wounds can lead to strength. If this story resonates with you, if you have ever felt the weight of silence and longed for justice, share this video so others may know they are not alone. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience, of truth, of the quiet power of fighting back. Together, we can shine light into the darkest corners. Together, we can reclaim our voices.